There is a particular kind of loneliness that only makes sense after you have been close to someone narcissistic. From the outside, the relationship may have looked passionate, magnetic, even unusually intense. There may have been chemistry, pursuit, flirtation, attention, and moments that felt almost hypnotic in how quickly they pulled you in. But behind that intensity, many people eventually discover something deeply unsettling. The closeness never really felt mutual for long. It felt consuming, performative, sometimes exciting, sometimes confusing, and then little by little, strangely empty. As though the person touching your body was never truly meeting your soul at all. That is one of the darker truths people struggle to name. Because intimacy in a narcissistic dynamic is often not built around emotional meeting. It is built around reinforcement. Around feeling wanted, admired, obeyed, chased, desired, or in control. It can look passionate on the surface, but underneath it often functions like a private theater where the narcissistic person is still trying to regulate self-worth, still trying to outrun emptiness, still trying to confirm power through someone else's attention. And when that is the real engine, the experience can leave you feeling more alone afterward than you did before it happened. That is usually the first clue that something deeper is wrong. A healthy intimate bond tends to create more safety over time, more steadiness, more mutuality, more emotional trust. But narcissistic intimacy often moves in the opposite direction. In the beginning, it can feel charged and flattering because they know how to create emotional momentum. They know how to make you feel chosen. They know how to make desire feel like proof of importance. But once they feel they have secured your attention, the quality of the connection often changes. Suddenly, intimacy becomes less about shared closeness and more about their mood, their appetite, their need for novelty, their need for ego reinforcement, or their need to prove they still have access to you. And that is where the confusion begins. Because most people enter intimacy expecting it to reveal truth, to deepen trust, to show you whether affection is real. But in narcissistic dynamics, intimacy is often one more place where the mask is managed. One more place where contradiction lives. Publicly, they may present as devoted, moral, restrained, deeply committed, even unusually polished. Privately, you start noticing the gap. The secrecy. The double life. The sense that they are always feeding off outside attention in some form, always scanning for admiration, always needing fresh proof that they are still desirable, still powerful, still central. That constant need for outside reinforcement is not a small detail. It is often the structure. For many narcissistic personalities, one source of validation is never enough for long. It is not because the partner is lacking. It is because the hunger itself is unstable. Compliments wear off. Attention fades too quickly. Familiarity starts feeling like boredom. What should have become deeper with trust now feels insufficient because the point was never genuine depth. The point was stimulation, proof, control, and the temporary relief of being wanted. So they start reaching outward. Sometimes emotionally, sometimes digitally, sometimes sexually, sometimes through flirtation, secret conversations, parallel attachments, or carefully hidden behavior that allows them to keep collecting attention while still preserving the image of being committed. This is why so many survivors say the relationship felt like two realities running at once. There was the version they sold to the world, and then there was the version you had to live with behind the curtain. The public self might have looked disciplined, respectable, charming, highly selective, even self-righteous about loyalty. But the private self often seemed driven by craving, entitlement, and a restless inability to stay grounded in ordinary closeness. They might talk about standards while violating yours. They might speak about honesty while building entire sections of the relationship on omission. They might act offended by suspicion while creating the exact conditions that make trust impossible. And over time, that starts affecting intimacy in ways that are hard to explain if you have never lived through it. You begin to feel that closeness does not actually bring you closer. The physical connection may happen, but the emotional follow-through is missing. The warmth stops abruptly. The tenderness feels selective. The aftercare is thin or absent. The moment is over, and so are you, at least in their mind. They may withdraw immediately, become distracted, turn cold, seem irritated by your need for affection, or act as though your longing for emotional connection is somehow excessive. What was supposed to feel like union instead leaves you feeling used, unseen, or strangely disposable. That is because, in these dynamics, the body is often included while the heart is kept at a distance. And once you start seeing that, more pieces begin to connect. Their obsession with image, their need to hide certain behaviors, their defensiveness around privacy, their tendency to project guilt onto you, their criticism of your body, your needs, your sensitivity, your expectations, their sudden contempt after periods of intensity, their hunger for novelty followed by indifference toward what is familiar. None of this is random. It is often what happens when intimacy is used as a source of narcissistic supply rather than a place of mutual emotional presence. That is why the relationship can become so painfully lonely even while you are still in it. You may still be sharing a bed, a house, a future plan, a routine, but emotionally you begin living beside a person who cannot sustain real closeness without trying to dominate it, manage it, or escape it. The loneliness becomes almost surreal. You are not lonely because you are physically alone. You are lonely because the person next to you keeps interacting with you as a function instead of a full human being. You are lonely because affection seems contingent, attention seems transactional, and your inner life only matters when it serves theirs. Then, eventually, something shifts. At some point, whether slowly or all at once, you begin realizing that what they call connection often depends on your silence, your adaptability, your forgiveness, and your willingness to ignore what your nervous system has already understood. You begin noticing that the relationship does not deepen with honesty. It destabilizes. You begin seeing that the problem is not that you need too much closeness. The problem is that genuine closeness was never the real goal on their side. And once you truly see that, once you stop trying to win emotional reciprocity from someone who is organized around self-gratification and control, you begin pulling your energy back. That is when the pattern enters a new phase. Because narcissistic people can tolerate a lot, but they do not tolerate loss of access well. Especially not from someone they assumed would remain emotionally available no matter how neglected, confused, or hurt they became. The moment they sense you are no longer playing your assigned role, the emotional temperature often changes fast. Not because love suddenly appears, but because control is being threatened. And when they realize you may not be coming back, the mask often shifts again. Sometimes the first thing they do is go silent. Not peaceful silence. Punitive silence. Strategic silence. The kind meant to make you feel the absence so sharply that you begin questioning yourself. They withdraw, disappear, refuse to respond, or act as though your very existence has become irrelevant. But the purpose is usually not indifference. It is pressure. They want the silence to do the work for them. They want you anxious, guilty, destabilized, and tempted to reopen contact just to stop the discomfort. It is one of the oldest control tactics in these dynamics because it makes your pain look like proof that they still matter more than your boundary does. If that does not work, many of them try a softer re-entry. This is where hoovering begins. Suddenly, the person who could not give you steady care when you were still there finds language for longing the moment you leave. A message appears. A memory. A late-night confession. A casual check-in that pretends nothing serious ever happened. Or a dramatic statement about how much they miss you, how much they have changed, how deeply they have reflected, how wrong they were, how different things will be now. And if you are still tender, still grieving, still partly bonded to the version of them you hoped was real, that can feel devastatingly persuasive. But the timing is the truth. They did not become emotionally available because they found empathy. They became emotionally expressive because access was threatened. That distinction matters. Hoovering is rarely about repair. It is usually about reactivation. They are testing whether the door still opens, whether your compassion can still be recruited, whether your loneliness can still be used against you, whether the emotional system they built inside you is still responsive enough to restart. And if even that fails, the tone can darken. This is where reputation attacks, half-truths, victim performances, and quiet distortions can begin. They start repositioning the story. They may paint you as unstable, cold, cruel, selfish, dramatic, mentally unwell, impossible to please, or somehow responsible for the collapse they helped create. Not because the story is true, but because image is oxygen to them, and losing control privately often pushes them to regain it publicly. If they cannot access you directly, they may try to access the narrative around you. And then comes one of the most seductive tactics of all, the promise of a new future. Suddenly, they can describe the exact life you wanted all along. The honesty, the consistency, the commitment, the healing, the maturity, the calmer version of the relationship you begged for when you were still exhausted and trying. They can speak about growth with moving precision. They can sound clearer than ever, softer than ever, more self-aware than ever. But if you listen closely, the pattern is usually the same. The language improves faster than the character. The promise arrives faster than the accountability. The future is painted beautifully because the future is cheaper than change. That is why so many survivors have to learn this the hard way. A narcissistic person will often offer more hope when they are losing control than they ever offered when they still had it. And that is not love. It is leverage. So if you are standing in the aftermath of one of these relationships, trying to make sense of why intimacy felt so intense yet so empty, why they seemed so hungry for you and yet so emotionally absent, why they became more expressive only after you began leaving, hear this clearly. The contradiction is the pattern. The loneliness was information. The secrecy was information. The inconsistency was information. And the sudden urgency after your withdrawal is information too. It tells you the relationship was never organized around mutual closeness the way you were told it was. It was organized around access. Access to your attention. Access to your body. Access to your loyalty. Access to your emotional labor. Access to the reassurance that someone was still there to absorb their instability, mirror back their desirability, and make them feel important. Once you understand that, so much of the confusion begins to settle. Not all the grief. Not all at once. But the confusion. And that matters. Because confusion is what keeps people circling back. Confusion makes you negotiate with patterns you have already survived. Confusion makes you treat breadcrumbs like breakthroughs. Confusion makes you mistake longing for evidence. But clarity starts doing something else. Clarity lets you see that the emptiness you felt was not because you were too needy to be satisfied. It was because you were trying to build emotional safety with someone who related to intimacy as a source of control more than a place of care. That is why leaving often feels like two losses at once. You lose the person, or rather the hope of who they might one day become, and you also lose the fantasy that all that intensity must have meant something deep and lasting. But what returns in place of that fantasy is something more honest. You begin reclaiming your own standards. You begin learning that real intimacy does not require secrecy to survive. It does not make you feel alone right after calling you loved. It does not deepen when you disappear and vanish when you stay. It does not need your confusion in order to keep you close. And the day you fully absorb that, the pattern starts losing its power. Not because they stop trying. Sometimes they do try. Sometimes they circle. Sometimes they bait. Sometimes they vanish. Sometimes they come back with a softer face and the same internal structure. But once you understand what the relationship was actually feeding, your response changes. You stop interpreting every return as proof of meaning. You stop interpreting every apology as evidence of transformation. You stop confusing desire with devotion. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, you begin choosing what feels steady over what feels consuming. That is the real escape. Not winning them back. Not proving them wrong. Not being chosen again. Learning how to stop calling control by the name of closeness.